The CIA has been working with the Ukrainians for over a decade, so let's talk about it. We're going to dive into a recent New York Times article and how it explores the relationship between the CIA and Ukraine over the past 10 years. It is very interesting and full of all kinds of really fascinating little nuggets. And I want to say up front that none of this is a surprise, and nobody reading that article or watching this video should take it as a surprise. I'll explain why later in this video. However, there's a link for the article down in the video description. I highly encourage all of you guys to go check it out. It's very interesting, and I'm going to talk about the highlights that I found really interesting from the article, but there's certainly going to be some pieces of the article that I'm not necessarily going to talk about that you might find interesting, so definitely go check it out. Major props to Adam Entos and Michael Schwartz, and hopefully I pronounced y'all's name right, for creating this really interesting article, so definitely check it out. They interviewed over 200 people, both in Ukraine and in other European countries and in the United States, to get this article produced. So very interesting stuff. Let's dive right in. Now, of course, in the introduction of the article, we get some very interesting pieces here from the jump. However, we get way more detail as the article progresses that we're going to talk about more. One of the first things I want to talk about is the consideration on when the relationship began. Whenever I said before that nobody should be surprised that there was a relationship between the CIA and Ukraine and how it has lasted for over 10 years, or at least 10 years, you need to kind of consider the history that had been going on in Ukraine up to that point and how these kinds of relationships tend to, come about. 2014, you have the Maidan revolution. You have the government of Ukraine kind of switching from a pro-Russian government to a pro-Western, pro-European government. And they're looking for friends because, of course, Russia annexes Crimea, a war kicks off the Donbass, and it's clear that Russia is not going to take that revolution just lying down. They're going to try some regime change of their own. So, of course, Ukraine is seeking friends and allies to help them defend themselves, and that leads them to the CIA, which, of course, the CIA is a willing partner in this relationship. There's some interesting bits from this article. Of course, there was the creation of the Special Ukrainian Unit, which was designed really for all kinds of clandestine and special missions. One of the missions was to capture a Russian drone and analyze a drone to identify what kind of encryption was being used and to break the Russian encryption. And that helped both Ukraine and the United States to eavesdrop on Russian communication for years after that. And that has become a very handy tool in the Ukrainian tool belt. And one of the officers of this special unit was one Kirilo Budanov, who you will know is the head of the military intelligence of Ukraine's armed forces. The relationship included the training of a new generation of Ukrainian spies. And we see that these spies have all, proliferated outward. They operate in Russia, Europe, as well as, interestingly, Cuba, and anywhere that Russia has any kind of relationship or a presence. And we've seen since the war began, Ukrainian special forces operating in like Africa, targeting Wagner Group and some other Russian forces in that area. So that's definitely an interesting thing that kind of was produced from this relationship. We see after the war started that some CIA officers stayed in Ukraine to help provide valuable intelligence to the Ukrainian army. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. That assistance was considered by one Ukrainian general to have been absolutely crucial for Ukrainian defense. So it's not just general intelligence that was being provided. It was very specific and accurate intelligence that was helping Ukraine understand, okay, well, these are clearly the Russian war plans for the next 2 weeks. And we're going to talk more about this. And this is how we can defend against that. One of the Russian narratives, of course, leading into this conflict, and since the conflict was that Russia was defending against CIA biolabs across Ukraine. Of course, the biolab part is completely fictional, but now we know that there were, in fact, CIA bases in Ukraine, at least bases that were partially or fully funded by the CIA, and at least operated by Ukrainian intelligence, and we'll talk about that as well. But the presence of those bases was known to the Russian SVR and the FSB, and that was a motivating factor for Putin to invade Ukraine. He, however, had misread the level of cooperation between the CIA and Ukraine. He had believed that the CIA was helping Ukraine launch lethal attacks into Russia and kind of being used as a springboard for NATO action into Russia. At least that was part of some of the thesis that at least has been claimed by elements of Russian propaganda in the Kremlin. Well, in reality, we're going to see, at least from this article, that the CIA was reluctant. And while that may be true, and given words from other world leaders, I do think that there was probably a similar level of risk aversion in the CIA as there is, amongst general leadership that you see not only across the United States, but across NATO. So I think it's plausible that the CIA was reluctant. But if you're going to operate in a country at war, you should probably know the risks, right? But we're going to talk about that because they knew the risks. I think there was some level of naivety, if I can even go so far as to say that, as to what the training and the intelligence that they were providing to Ukraine was actually going to do. So as the article goes further, we see the reluctance of the CIA to work in Ukraine and kind of some of the reasoning why that had happened, right? Again, this kind of, the article kind of pivots into a history on, the original, like the founding of this relationship and kind of some of the backstory, right? So shortly after Maidan, Ukraine has just flipped over to a new pro-Western government, and they're looking for friends. And the CIA is kind of interested in this relationship, but they're also hesitant to get into this relationship because they had previously been burned in Ukraine. Now, it's interesting what happened. So 1991, of course, the Soviet Union falls apart. Ukraine gains independence, and a similar situation happens. Ukraine is looking for friends. So the CIA had worked actually with a similar individual that was the head of the Ukrainian intelligence at that time to the one that was the head of the Ukrainian intelligence in 2014. So a little bit of deja vu probably going on at the agency. And of course, the CIA at the time wanted a close relationship to Ukraine. But then, of course, Russia was able to retake over the Ukrainian government, get some pro-Russian individuals in those key positions, and then the whole country kind of flipped back over towards Russia, right? And so a lot of those connections got burned. So the CIA didn't want kind of a repeat of that situation happening again. And of course, since it was the same spy chief, definitely some deja vu, certainly. However, he was pretty persistent. The Ukrainian spy chief was pretty persistent. An analogy summed it up pretty perfectly, kind of what ended up forming out of this relationship, right? And this was from one American official. Quote, "They wanted to fish, but we couldn't give them fish for policy reasons. But we were perfectly happy to teach them to fish and deliver them fly fishing equipment." I think that's very interesting, right? We see, the CIA providing them all kinds of IT equipment for telecommunications. We see them providing training to their armed forces as well as to their intelligence agencies. Really the Ukrainian intelligence services were kind of revamped in a large part because of this relationship with the CIA. And it's clear, at least in this article, that Ukraine initiated and wanted this relationship. This wasn't something that the CIA pushed for, or, the CIA was trying to develop themselves. Perhaps, maybe not mentioned in the article, that some of that could have been going on. But at least from the scope of this article, from what we know here, that doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't, however, hide the fact that the CIA knew that it could benefit well from that relationship. It just understood that there were risks to it, not only from, the history of the CIA getting burned after the Soviet Union collapse, but also to the proximity to Russia and to, how the intelligence services had been absolutely loaded with Russian sympathizers, and how Ukraine was at war with Russia. And if the CIA got burned helping with any kind of lethal operation, and Russia found out about that, then that could really kind of change the entire dynamic, and we kind of see an example of what that could have looked like later in this article. But really kind of part of one of the ways that the CIA could have benefited from this relationship, the CIA struggled with recruitment, and the Ukrainians made it much easier. They kind of described the situation as it was ultimate treason for a Russian to work with the Americans. But for a Russian to work with the Ukrainians, it was just two brothers having a conversation over beer. And that's kind of an interesting description there. We've seen since the war started, actually, I don't know if any of you guys follow their Twitter account, but the CIA has posted ads in Russian to recruit Russians. Now, maybe that is a genuine recruitment, resource or technique. Maybe it isn't. In my mind, I would think that is a distraction or kind of more of a psyop on Russian intelligence services saying, look, we're trying to recruit in your country, so pay attention to us. You don't normally see them posting videos in Chinese saying, hey, come work for us. They're generally trying to recruit way more subtly, right? But in this case, they're posting a video about it, which to me says, hey, look at this shiny object over here. while the Ukrainians are actually building out their intelligence network. It's drawing resources and eyeballs away. Maybe it's working, maybe it's not. But that's just kind of how I interpret that, especially based off of, this description of the relationship and kind of how Ukrainians have a better time recruiting assets in Russia. As the article continues, as the partnership deepened between Ukraine and the CIA, the CIA helped create 12 spy bases along the border with Russia in what was called Operation Goldfish. These bases would be run by Ukrainians and would facilitate intelligence operations in Russia, but also by Ukrainians. I found this very interesting. It would also help facilitating the training and deployment of Ukrainian sleeper agents who would fight guerrilla-style warfare against Russians should occupation come. And wouldn't you know it, that has actually happened. And we've actually seen guerrilla-style and partisan operations happening behind the Russian lines, and they've targeted all kinds of Russian-sympathizing leadership across the Russian-occupied areas, as well as Russian military leadership, and also helping facilitate the movement of Ukrainian personnel behind the lines and really setting up Ukrainian operations. This has been a very interesting thing to see play out, because a lot of the framing that you kind of see in this article, you actually see, it's like they're building something here with this relationship before the war, and then after the war, you actually see it in action. That kind of leads some credibility to what's being said here. Of course, I mentioned in the beginning of the video, and the article mentions it earlier as well, that the CIA did not want to be involved in lethal operations. And that was at least at this point, whenever Operation Goldfish kicked off, and that's around 2016. That did not, however, prevent the Ukrainians from kicking off and executing their own lethal operations. And they had to do it ultimately without the CIA knowing about it. We get to see actually a story with a familiar character, then Lieutenant Colonel Budanov, who was a rising star in Ukraine's intelligence paramilitary arm, and he had very close ties to the CIA. It describes an instance where he had been wounded in fighting in the Donbass, where he was shot in the arm, and he had such a close relationship that he actually rehabbed in Walter Reed in Maryland before returning back to Ukraine. So a pretty close relationship. He is a leader of a team that is attempting to infiltrate Crimea to destroy some Russian aircraft that they believed was going to launch a surprise attack. And so they try infiltrating with small boats at nighttime. However, they're met on the shores by Russian special operations forces as well. And so the whole thing goes haywire. They ultimately have to ditch the boats and swim all the way back to Ukraine for hours, it says. And I don't know about you. I mean, I love to swim. I love swimming. But swimming at nighttime in full kit with the Russians looking for you sounds absolutely miserable. So, crazy that they did that. But this ultimately became a huge international issue. Of course, this was a lethal operation. You're planting bombs. There's a chance you could kill somebody. You're destroying very valuable equipment. The CIA, reportedly at least, did not know about this attack. All right? From the article. Maybe they did in real life. Don't know. I'm going off of what the article says. But, Putin claimed that Ukraine was planning and trying to execute a terrorist attack, and he vowed revenge for the Russian troops that had been killed in that operation. Of course, at this time, this was the Obama administration, and they were furious. And the article even named another familiar face, then Vice President Joe Biden, who had been reportedly a pretty huge champion of this program and this relationship between the CIA and Ukraine. It mentions a phone call where Joe Biden was talking with one of the Ukrainian leadership, and he basically is saying, it's becoming harder for me to advocate for you guys because of that operation. The CIA, it kind of reiterates that they had not been notified of that operation, and they were pretty angry that had happened without them knowing. So Ukraine basically pushed back saying it's their war and they had to fight it. And very interesting kind of relationship going on here. I mean, I don't know how you kind of facilitate a lot of sophisticated training, equipping, all of this and funding for a country that is in an active conflict without kind of realizing, okay, maybe they could use some of this for offensive actions. It's like people learning jujitsu. That's pretty popular now. A teacher might teach it for self-defense, or it's like firearms, right? People would teach firearm education for self-defense, and then so-and-so goes and uses those skills for offensive purposes, right? I don't know how they kind of do all this without realizing, okay, maybe the Ukrainians are going to use some of this to fight the war that they're in. But hey, fight they did. And the article describes then after this a series of attacks where the Ukrainians had killed a number of Russian militia leaders in the Donbass. And the Russians ended up killing the head of Ukraine's paramilitary group, the Ukrainian intelligence paramilitary group. And this is whenever things started to get pretty tough for the Ukrainian intelligence and for the CIA, because this was kind of they're realizing this is real, that Ukraine's going to continue fighting. The support that we're providing for them is going to continue to be used in an offensive capacity. And, you can't necessarily stop it, right? Of course, by this point, the election had hit and Donald Trump was elected. And of course, I think we can all remember some of the rhetoric that Donald Trump used regarding Russia, right? But despite the rhetoric, the article describes that the partnership actually increased. It grew in sophistication under Trump, with then CIA chief Mike Pompeo and then National Defense Advisor John Bolton. They were both very hawkish about Russia. And so the article that kind of describes that, while Trump's rhetoric went one way, the administration itself went the complete opposite. And it kind of makes me think of this like kind of a good cop, bad cop routine, where Trump would verbally praise, somebody in the public light, and then that would kind of earn some kind of political capital. But the administration itself would actually kind of go pretty hard and go pretty aggressive against the leader. And a reason that I kind of think about that is like Kim Jong-un. You have Trump kind of saying some nice things about Kim Jong-un. They end up having a meeting, very famous, and, things kind of seem kind of warm between the two. However, people forget that in 2017, we were very close to going to war again with North Korea, and things were pretty bad. So you have, kind of an administration effort similar, that's kind of going tough on Russia, and increasing a partnership with Ukraine that is becoming increasingly more lethal, while you have public rhetoric that's kind of veiling the whole thing, right? Kind of makes me interested to know what would happen after this election, but we'll see. Of course, just before the war, the CIA and other European partners had all formed a coalition, and they had decided they're going to work with Ukraine. They're going to, go after Russia pretty aggressively. And they told Ukraine that Putin was planning they're planning to go to war to decapitate the Ukrainian government. Of course, the article describes how the Ukrainians were unconvinced to the point that multiple meetings were being held, and one MI6 officer even teared up during one briefing during their, with the counterparts, because he was worried that their counterparts were going to be killed. And this is kind of I think a stark reminder that these are humans. We think of like James Bond or, whatever, and these are all like kind of stoic individuals, almost robotic in how they do things, but they're still human beings, and they are forming human relationships with their counterparts, and they're doing something that they feel passionate about. You're not necessarily getting into the intelligence business, which is not an easy thing to do, without feeling passionate about what you're doing, and you feel like what you're doing is right. And we kind of see that this is playing out right here, and we even see this dynamic where, the Western leaders are warning Ukraine that a war is about to happen and Ukraine's not convinced. We saw that playing out in, the open space. We see President Biden, we see then, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, all kind of giving these speeches saying, look, Russia is preparing to go to war. And then, you have President Zelensky on the other side saying, we're just not sure about it, So it's interesting that also kind of played out in the intelligence sphere as well. However, once the war began, of course, the U.S. government pretty much evacuated everybody from Ukraine, except for a small team of CIA officers who remained in Western Ukraine, it says in some hotel, to basically continue the relationship. They continue to brief their Ukrainian counterparts, provide intelligence, and this ended up actually springboarding the CIA-Ukrainian relationship. With the war starting as well, the CIA decided to take the gloves off. They were now going to help consciously facilitate lethal operations against Russia. However, the article says on Ukrainian soil. And I think that is an important distinction because, again, since the war began, we've seen Ukrainian launch actions on Russian soil. Lots of actions, some very high-profile attacks. However, I think if this is, again, true, we're going to take what is said as accurate, right? Then that would all be kind of a similar example to before the war, where the Ukrainian intelligence is taking action on their own. and the CIA is kind of helping within their own scope. And that is providing valuable intelligence not only for Ukraine but for the United States. But they're staying within their scope. While the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian intelligence services are kind of, look, they're at war. They're going to do whatever they have to do. And of course, then that leaves us with present day. And of course, the partnership appears to continue to be working. And the article kind of concludes saying that it is providing more intelligence now than ever before on Russia. Of course, there's some concern in Ukrainian intelligence services about whether or not the U.S. will abandon Ukraine. It's not, that concern's not just within Ukrainian intelligence. I think everybody's a little concerned about that. I think the ghost of Afghanistan kind of looms large over everything, and kind of the way we pulled out of Afghanistan. And the Ukrainians are kind of worried that the same would happen to them. But I think this is a really excellent piece by Adam and Michael. I think it is incredibly fascinating. Certainly check it out. And I think whenever the war is over, this whole thing should be kind of made into a movie. I think it's better than most Tom Clancy novels. And I enjoyed Tom Clancy, so I think that's high praise. But of course, you read the headline. You hear any time the CIA gets mentioned, everybody seems to freak out because everybody's thinking, JFK assassination or MK Ultra or, Iranian coup or whatever, right? There's some pretty dark blemishes in the agency's history, but that kind of overshadows the bulk of the work that they're actually doing, which is this kind of stuff. Just mundane, almost, intelligence collection and working with the partners that are willing to work with them. And I think that is a very important distinction. Yes. Sometimes, we've seen through history, the U.S. just kind of strong arm a relationship or a decision by somebody. But in this kind of sphere, where the goal is to produce intelligence quietly, you need a willing partner on the other side, and it's all built on trust. So I genuinely believe that none of this relationship would have happened if the Ukrainians themselves did not genuinely want this relationship for themselves as well. And I think that that's interesting to see. And I think that's important, to kind of, for everybody to realize it's not a bunch of puppet masters. It's human beings that are doing what they think is right. Sometimes they're doing it incredibly poorly, and sometimes what they believe is terribly wrong. But it's human beings that are working with each other. And I'll be eager to see, as the war progresses, whether we see, any indications of where this relationship goes into the future, especially as aid to Ukraine is kind of an open question. And with the election coming up, the article makes no secrets. There were plenty of bumps in the road in this relationship. And we can definitely see that. And it doesn't just play out in the intelligence sphere. It plays out open. We see a lot of that today as well. But, there will surely be some bumps in the future, but we'll kind of have to wait and see, I guess. So interesting stuff. Check it out if you liked it. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and leave a comment about what you think on this stuff. Because boy, that's interesting stuff. And with all that, I will see you all later.